In the dusty archives of the Providence Historical Society, a photograph from March 1904 has remained forgotten for over a century. The image shows the prominent Underwood family posing in their Federal Hill Mansion's parlor, Jonathan Underwood, his wife Beatrice, and their newly hired domestic servant. But there's something unsettling about the hands visible in this portrait. The servant's right hand resting casually on the back of Mrs. Underwood's chair bears distinct scars across the knuckles and palm. What investigators didn't realize in 1920 was that these same scars had been described 16 different times in police reports spanning nearly 2 decades. 16 different times by 16 different witnesses, all describing the last woman they saw with their employers' wives before those women died in mysterious household accidents. The photograph, buried in a collection of evidence from an insurance fraud case, would finally reveal the identity of one of America's most methodical and undetected serial killers. Before we continue with the story of Elizabeth Hayes and the tragedy that befell the wives of Providence's elite, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our dark historical mysteries. And tell us in the comments what state are you listening from. We love connecting with fellow mystery enthusiasts across the country. The spring of 1904 would mark the beginning of what Providence newspapers would later call the Widowmaker's reign, though they wouldn't understand the true horror of that title for another 16 years. Providence in 1904 stood as New England's second largest city. Its prosperity built on the shoulders of textile mills, jewelry manufacturing, and shipping. The city's Federal Hill and Benefit Street neighborhoods housed magnificent Victorian mansions, their Gothic Revival spires an elaborate ironwork testament to the wealth generated by Rhode Island's industrial boom. Gas lamps flickered along cobblestone streets where carriages shared space with the occasional motorcar, while the acrid smell of cold smoke mixed with salt air from Narragansett Bay. The Underwood family represented Providence's new aristocracy perfectly. Jonathan Underwood, 43, had built his fortune manufacturing precision instruments for the expanding railroad industry. His workshop on South Main Street employed over 60 men, producing the brass gauges and mechanical components that kept America's trains running on schedule. His wife, Beatrice, 38, came from old New England stock. Her father had been a whaling captain out of New Bedford before retiring to manage his investments in textile mills. Their Federal Hill mansion, built in 1887, stood 3 stories tall with bay windows that caught the afternoon light and cast long shadows across polished hardwood floors. The house required constant maintenance. Coal needed hauling to the basement furnace. Gas lamps required daily attention, and the elaborate Victorian decor demanded careful cleaning. Like most families of their station, the Underwoods employed several servants, but domestic help had become increasingly difficult to retain. The younger Irish and Italian immigrant women who once filled such positions now sought work in the textile mills, where they could earn better wages and enjoy more freedom. It was this shortage of reliable domestic help that led Beatrice Underwood to place an advertisement in the Providence Journal on March 15, 1904. Wanted experienced housekeeper for prominent Federal Hill family. Must be of good character with references, generous wages for suitable candidate. The advertisement would attract exactly the kind of response Beatrice hoped for, though not for the reasons she imagined. Elizabeth Hayes arrived at the Underwood mansion on a gray March morning, carrying a small leather satchel and wearing a simple black dress that spoke of both respectability and mourning. She appeared to be in her early 40s, with prematurely gray hair, pulled back severely, and pale blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the room she entered. Her references written on expensive letterhead from families in Boston and Hartford praised her discretion, her skill with household management, and her particular talent for caring for delicate wives who suffered from the nervous disorders so common among the upper classes. What impressed Beatrice most during their interview was Elizabeth's immediate understanding of the complexities of running a Victorian household. She knew exactly how to tend the gas fixtures without creating dangerous leaks, how to manage the cold-burning stove without filling rooms with smoke, and how to handle the delicate cleaning required for Beatrix's extensive collection of crystal and china. Her hands, though bearing scars, she explained away as old kitchen accidents, moved with practiced confidence as she examined the household's requirements. I understand the particular needs of ladies who find themselves overwhelmed by social obligations, Elizabeth told Beatrice in her soft Irish accent. My previous employers often suffered from headaches and nervous exhaustion. I've learned to prepare special remedies that help with such conditions. Her smile was gentle, almost maternal, and Beatrice felt immediately at ease with this woman who seemed to understand the burdens of her position. The photograph taken that March afternoon was meant to commemorate the completion of a successful hiring process. Jonathan had recently purchased one of the new Kodak cameras, and he wanted to document their household staff for his business records. The three figures arranged themselves in the parlor, Jonathan standing beside his wife's chair with his hand on her shoulder, Beatrice seated with her hands folded in her lap, and Elizabeth positioned slightly behind, her scarred right hand resting on the back of Beatrix's chair in a gesture that seemed both protective and possessive. Neither Jonathan nor Beatrice noticed how Elizabeth's eyes remained fixed on Beatrix's jewelry during the long exposure required for the photograph. They couldn't have known that those pale blue eyes were already cataloging the worth of Beatrix's diamond earrings, her sapphire brooch, and the elaborate gold bracelet that had belonged to her grandmother. They had no way of understanding that the woman they'd welcomed into their home was already planning their tragedy. Spring in Providence carried the promise of renewal, but inside the Underwood mansion, a different kind of transformation was taking place. Elizabeth Hayes settled into her role with the efficiency of someone who had perfected a deadly routine. She rose before dawn to tend the furnace, prepared meals with meticulous care, and maintained the household with an attention to detail that impressed both Jonathan and Beatrice. But her most important work happened in the quiet hours when the family slept, when she could move through the house like a shadow, learning its secrets. Victorian homes were complex organisms of pipes, ducts, and mechanical systems that few people fully understood. Gas lines ran through walls to feed the ornate fixtures in every room. Hot air ducts carried heat from the basement furnace to upper floors. The electrical system, newly installed, shared space with older gas lines in ways that sometimes created unexpected hazards. Elizabeth studied these systems with the dedication of an engineer, tracing every pipe and wire until she understood exactly how the house functioned and how it could malfunction. During her first month of employment, Elizabeth demonstrated the kind of devotion that made employers feel guilty about their previous complaints regarding domestic help. She anticipated Beatrix's needs before they were expressed, prepared Jonathan's morning coffee exactly to his preferences, and maintained the house with spotless efficiency. More importantly, she seemed to genuinely care about Beatrix's well-being, often commenting on how tired the lady of the house appeared and suggesting remedies for her frequent headaches. "Miss Underwood works herself too hard," Elizabeth would say to Jonathan with concerned eyes. All these social obligations, the stress of managing such a large household. It's no wonder she suffers from nervous exhaustion. Perhaps she needs more rest, more quiet time away from visitors. Her suggestion seemed so reasonable, so caring that Jonathan began limiting the social events that had always been central to Beatrix's happiness. The isolation began subtly. Elizabeth would mention to callers that Mrs. Underwood was indisposed, suffering from one of her headaches. She'd rescheduled social engagements, explaining that the doctor had recommended complete rest. Gradually, Beatrice found herself spending more time alone with Elizabeth, depending increasingly on the servants' company and care. The woman seemed to understand her moods, her fears, her increasing sense that something in her life was changing in ways she couldn't quite identify. It was during the 4th week of May that Beatrice first mentioned the strange dreams. She confided to Elizabeth that she'd been experiencing vivid, disturbing sleep filled with images of suffocation and falling. She'd wake gasping, her nightgown soaked with perspiration. Convinced that someone had been in her room during the night, Elizabeth listened with sympathetic attention, suggesting that perhaps the gas lamp in the bedroom was burning improperly and affecting Mrs. Underwood's sleep. These old gas fixtures can be temperamental, Elizabeth explained as she adjusted the bedroom lamp. Sometimes they don't burn clean, especially at night when the pressure changes. The fumes can cause the most terrible nightmares. Her fingers worked expertly at the fixture's mechanism, making adjustments that she claimed would improve the air quality in the room. What Beatrice couldn't see was how those same skilled fingers could create a nearly invisible leak that would release just enough gas to cause disorientation and weakness without immediately threatening life. The first serious incident occurred on the night of May 29, 1904. Jonathan was attending a business dinner in downtown Providence, leaving Beatrice alone with Elizabeth for the evening. They dined together in the smaller breakfast room rather than the formal dining room, Elizabeth having suggested that the intimate setting would be more relaxing for Mrs. Underwood's nerves. The meal was simple but elegant: roasted chicken with herbs, fresh vegetables from the garden, and a bottle of wine that Elizabeth recommended for its calming properties. As they ate, Elizabeth spoke fondly of her previous employment with families in Boston, describing the tragic circumstances that had led to her seeking new positions. Her former employer, Mrs. Victoria Livingston, had been much like Beatrice, refined, intelligent, but troubled by the pressures of social expectations. She used to tell me that she felt trapped by all the obligations, the constant need to maintain appearances, Elizabeth said with a wistful expression. Poor dear, she never found peace until the end. Beatrice found herself confiding her own struggles, the exhaustion of managing social obligations, the pressure of maintaining Jonathan's business relationships, the growing sense that her life was somehow slipping away from her. Elizabeth listened with the attention of a confessor, occasionally reaching across the table to pat Beatrix's hand with those scarred fingers that seemed so gentle and understanding. After dinner, Elizabeth suggested they retire early as Mrs. Underwood appeared particularly tired. She helped Beatrix prepare for bed, brushing her hair with long, soothing strokes and ensuring that the bedroom was properly ventilated. The gas lamp burned with a steady, seemingly normal flame, casting dancing shadows on the wallpapered walls. Elizabeth kissed Beatrix's forehead in a gesture that felt almost maternal before retiring to her own room in the servants' quarters. What happened during the hours that followed would later become a subject of intense investigation, though the truth would remain hidden for 16 more years. Beatrice Underwood was found the next morning at the bottom of the main staircase, her neck broken from what appeared to be a tragic fall. She was wearing her silk nightgown and her grandmother's gold bracelet, but her diamond earrings and sapphire brooch were missing from the jewelry box in her bedroom. Elizabeth's screams when she discovered the body brought neighbors running. Her grief appeared genuine and overwhelming as she knelt beside Beatrix's broken form, cradling the dead woman's head and sobbing about how she should have heard something, should have been able to help. When Jonathan arrived, summoned by telegram from his business meeting, he found Elizabeth still holding vigil beside his wife's body, her dress stained with blood and tears streaming down her face. The Providence Police Department in 1904 operated with the limited investigative techniques of the era. Detective Captain William Brennan, an Irish immigrant son who had worked his way up through the ranks, arrived at the Underwood mansion that gray May morning, expecting to document another tragic household accident. Victorian homes were notorious for such incidents: gas leaks, falls down steep staircases, accidents with coal furnaces, and electrical systems that few people fully understood. Captain Brennan's initial examination revealed what appeared to be a straightforward case of accidental death. Beatrice Underwood had apparently risen during the night, perhaps to visit the water closet or investigate a sound, and had somehow lost her footing on the polished wooden stairs. The steep Victorian staircase, with its elaborate banister and runner that could shift underfoot, had claimed other victims in Providence's grand homes. Her injuries were consistent with a fall from the top landing to the marble floor of the entrance hall. Elizabeth Hayes provided a clear account of the evening's events. She had served dinner, helped Mrs. Underwood prepare for bed, and retired to her own quarters in the servants' wing around 10:00. She had heard nothing unusual during the night, sleeping soundly until she rose at her customary 5:30 to begin preparations for breakfast, upon discovering that Mrs. Underwood had not come down for her morning tea. Elizabeth had gone upstairs to check on her employer, only to find the bedroom empty, and then discover the terrible scene at the bottom of the stairs. Jonathan Underwood, devastated by the loss of his wife, accepted the tragedy as one of those cruel accidents that befell even the most careful households. The missing jewelry was easily explained. Beatrice often removed her earrings and brooch before bed, and in his grief Jonathan couldn't remember exactly what had been in the jewelry box. The pieces might have been taken for cleaning or repair, or simply misplaced in the chaos following the discovery of the body. What Captain Brennan noted in his report, though he didn't consider it significant at the time, were the distinctive scars on Elizabeth Hayes's right hand, as she gestured while describing the evening's events. The old wounds were clearly visible across her knuckles and palm. When he asked about them, she explained that they were the result of a kitchen accident years earlier, when she had fallen against a hot stove while working for a family in Hartford. The explanation seemed reasonable enough for someone who had spent years in domestic service. Elizabeth remained with Jonathan Underwood through the difficult weeks following Beatrix's funeral, helping him manage the household and cope with his grief. She proved invaluable during this period, handling correspondence with sympathy callers, managing the influx of food and flowers from neighbors, and maintaining the house's routine when Jonathan seemed incapable of making even basic decisions. Her presence provided stability during the worst period of his life. By late summer of 1904, however, Jonathan began to feel that maintaining such a large household was beyond his needs or interests. The mansion held too many memories of Beatrice, and he found himself considering a move to smaller quarters downtown, closer to his business. When he mentioned these thoughts to Elizabeth, she immediately understood that her services would no longer be required. She accepted the news with graceful resignation, expressing only concern for Mr. Underwood's future well-being and gratitude for the opportunity to serve such a fine family during their time of need. On September 15, 1904, Elizabeth Hayes departed the Underwood mansion with the same small leather satchel she had carried upon her arrival. Jonathan provided her with generous compensation and an excellent reference letter praising her dedication during the family's darkest hours. She mentioned that she planned to seek employment in Hartford, where she had connections from her previous work. Jonathan wished her well and never expected to hear from or about her again. What Jonathan couldn't have known was that Elizabeth's departure from Providence was only temporary. She would return to Rhode Island within 2 years, though not to the same neighborhood or social circle where she might be recognized. The industrial expansion of the early 1900s had created opportunities for a woman with her skills and knowledge, particularly among the newly wealthy families who had built mansions in Providence's expanding suburbs. These new industrialists, men who had made fortunes in manufacturing, shipping, and trade, often married women from modest backgrounds, who suddenly found themselves struggling to manage elaborate households and complex social obligations. They were perfect targets for someone who understood exactly how to exploit the vulnerabilities of wives who felt overwhelmed by their new stations in life. Between 1906 and 1918, Providence would witness a disturbing pattern of household accidents involving the wives of prominent businessmen. The incidents shared certain characteristics. They typically occurred when husbands were away on business. The victims were found by recently hired domestic servants, and small valuable items often went missing in the confusion following the discovery of the bodies. But these similarities weren't immediately apparent to investigators working individual cases separated by months or years. The pattern might have continued indefinitely if not for the intersection of tragedy and greed that would finally expose Elizabeth Hayes in 1920. An insurance investigator reviewing claims from the seemingly unrelated household accidents would discover connections that had eluded police for nearly 2 decades. But that revelation lay 16 years in the future, while Elizabeth Hayes continued her deadly work with the confidence of someone who had perfected an invisible crime. The photograph taken in the Underwood parlor that March afternoon in 1904 remained filed away, forgotten among the routine documentation of a tragic accident. Those scarred hands, captured forever in the silver emulsion, waited patiently to tell their story to someone who would finally understand their significance. The years following Beatrice Underwood's death saw Providence transformed by the industrial prosperity of the early 20th century. New fortunes were built on manufacturing precision instruments, processing rubber, and managing the complex logistics of New England's expanding economy. With these fortunes came new mansions, new social hierarchies, and new opportunities for those who understood how to navigate the vulnerabilities of the wealthy. Elizabeth Hayes, now using the name Catherine Lynch, established herself in Hartford briefly before returning to Rhode Island in 1906. She had learned to vary her appearance subtly. Different hairstyles, slight changes in dress, careful modulation of her accent depending on her employer's expectations. To families seeking Irish domestics, she emphasized her heritage. To those preferring English servants, she softened her brogue and spoke of employment with Boston families. Her references, written on letterheads from towns where verification would be difficult, painted the portrait of an experienced housekeeper who specialized in caring for delicate mistresses prone to nervous conditions. Her second Providence victim was Margaret Tillinghast, wife of textile manufacturer David Tillinghast, whose Elmwood mansion represented the pinnacle of 1890's architectural ambition. The Gothic Revival house, with its complex network of gas lines and steam heating, provided Elizabeth with challenges and opportunities. Margaret, 20 years younger than her husband and struggling to manage social obligations that seemed beyond her capabilities, welcomed Elizabeth's arrival in October 1906 with desperate relief. The pattern that Elizabeth had perfected in the Underwood household repeated itself with deadly efficiency. She began by isolating Margaret from friends and family, suggesting that social gatherings were too taxing for someone of such delicate constitution. She prepared special meals and remedies that gradually weakened Margaret's energy and concentration. Most importantly, she spent hours each night studying the house's mechanical systems, learning how to create the perfect accidental death. Margaret Tillinghast was found on December 12, 1906, apparently overcome by gas fumes in her bedroom. The ornate gas chandelier had malfunctioned during the night, filling the room with deadly vapors while Margaret slept. Elizabeth, whose room was in a different wing of the house, discovered the tragedy when Margaret failed to appear for breakfast. The grief-stricken Elizabeth had managed to open windows and summon help, but it was too late to save her employer. Detective Captain Brennan, now promoted to lead Providence's detective division, investigated the Tillinghast death with the thoroughness that his experience demanded. Gas accidents were unfortunately common in homes with older fixtures, particularly during winter months when windows remained closed and ventilation was poor. The chandelier in Margaret's bedroom showed signs of mechanical failure that could easily have occurred naturally over time. Elizabeth Lynch provided a detailed account of the evening, mentioning that she had noticed the gas burning with an unusual color the previous day and had planned to recommend calling a repair service. What struck Brennan as he interviewed Elizabeth was a vague sense of familiarity. Her scarred right hand, visible as she gestured during their conversation, seemed somehow familiar, though he couldn't immediately place where he might have encountered her before. When he mentioned this impression, Elizabeth explained that she had previously worked for the Underwood family and had spoken with police following poor Mrs. Underwood's tragic fall. The connection seemed reasonable enough. Providence's domestic service community was relatively small, and experienced housekeepers often moved between prominent families. The missing jewelry from Margaret Tillinghast's bedroom was explained by Elizabeth's suggestion that Mrs. Tillinghast had recently had several pieces cleaned and repaired. In the chaos following the discovery of the gas leak, no one could remember exactly which items had been sent to the jeweler. David Tillinghast, consumed by guilt over his wife's death and his frequent business absences, accepted these explanations without question. Elizabeth remained with the Tillinghast household through the winter of 1907, helping David manage his grief and the complex process of closing such a large establishment. When he decided to move to a smaller house in downtown Providence, she accepted her dismissal with the same graceful resignation she had shown with Jonathan Underwood. Her references from the Tillinghast family praised her devotion during their time of crisis and recommended her without reservation to future employers. Between 1907 and 1918, Elizabeth Hayes, using various names and slight modifications to her appearance, would claim 13 more victims across Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. She developed an almost scientific approach to her crimes, varying her methods to avoid establishing recognizable patterns. Some women died in falls, others from gas leaks or electrical accidents. A few suffered what appeared to be heart attacks brought on by gradually administered poisons that mimic natural illnesses. Her success depended on several factors that made detection nearly impossible given the investigative limitations of the era. First, she always worked as a live-in domestic, giving her intimate access to her victims' routines and the mechanical systems of their homes. Second, she chose victims who were already suffering from anxiety, depression, or physical ailments that made sudden death seem plausible. Third, she moved frequently between cities and states, ensuring that no single police department would investigate multiple similar cases. Most importantly, Elizabeth understood the social dynamics that protected her from suspicion. Domestic servants occupied an invisible position in upper-class households, essential to daily functioning, but largely ignored by the families they served. Police investigators rarely considered the possibility that a grieving servant might be responsible for her employer's death, particularly when that servant appeared devastated by the loss and provided helpful testimony about the victim's final days. The scarred hands that had been noted in police reports from 16 different investigations over 14 years represented the only consistent physical evidence linking these crimes. But without centralized record-keeping or communication between jurisdictions, no investigator had access to the complete pattern. Each case was investigated in isolation, filed away as another tragic household accident, while Elizabeth Hayes continued her deadly work with increasing confidence and sophistication. By 1918, Elizabeth Hayes had refined her methods to an art form that would have continued indefinitely if not for an unexpected complication. Her latest victim, Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald of Newport, had died in what appeared to be a tragic fall down the servants' stairs while investigating a disturbance in the kitchen. Elizabeth, now calling herself Mary Sullivan, had been employed by the Fitzgerald family for only 6 weeks, but her grief over the accident seemed genuine and heartfelt. She had immediately summoned help, stayed with Mrs. Fitzgerald until the doctor arrived and provided detailed testimony about the events leading to the tragedy. What Elizabeth didn't know was that Mrs. Fitzgerald's nephew, Thomas Brennan, Jr., was a recent graduate of Harvard Law School who had developed an interest in forensic investigation. Young Brennan had heard stories from his father, Providence Detective Captain William Brennan, about the strange series of household accidents that seemed to plague Rhode Island's wealthy families. When his aunt became another victim, Thomas decided to conduct his own informal investigation into what he began to suspect might not be accidents at all. Thomas began by examining the physical evidence more carefully than local police had done. The servants' stairs, where his aunt had fallen, were in excellent repair with new carpeting and a sturdy banister. Elena Fitzgerald, though in her 50s, had been in good health with no history of balance problems or dizzy spells. The supposed disturbance in the kitchen that had drawn her downstairs at midnight had left no evidence, no broken dishes, no signs of intrusion, no indication of what might have caused the noise that Mary Sullivan claimed to have heard from her room. More troubling was Thomas's discovery that several valuable pieces of his aunt's jewelry were missing from her bedroom. Mary Sullivan suggested that Mrs. Fitzgerald might have hidden them for safekeeping given recent reports of burglaries in Newport, but Thomas found no evidence that his aunt had been concerned about theft. The missing items, a diamond necklace, emerald earrings, and an antique gold bracelet, represented several thousand in value, a significant loss that seemed suspicious in connection with an accidental death. Thomas's legal training had taught him the importance of systematic investigation, so he began researching similar cases throughout New England. What he discovered alarmed him deeply. Over the previous 14 years, at least 16 wives of prominent businessmen had died in household accidents, and in every case, the family had recently hired a new domestic servant who discovered the body. The servants were always women between 40 and 50, always carried excellent references from previous positions, and always seemed devastated by their employers' deaths. The breakthrough came when Thomas visited his father's office in Providence and reviewed the old case files. Detective Captain Brennan had maintained detailed records of his investigations, including physical descriptions of witnesses and suspects. As Thomas read through the files, a pattern began to emerge that had been invisible when the cases were considered individually. 16 different investigations over 14 years had documented conversations with domestic servants who bore distinctive scars on their right hands. "Look at this, Father," Thomas said, spreading the files across Captain Brennan's desk. March 1904, Beatrice Underwood case. You noted that the housekeeper, Elizabeth Hayes, had old scars across the knuckles and palm of her right hand. December 1906, Margaret Tillinghast case. The housekeeper, Catherine Lynch, had similar scars from what she claimed was a kitchen accident. Here's another from 1909 and another from 1912. Every single case mentions the same type of scars on the right hand. Captain Brennan studied the files with growing amazement. The pattern that his son had identified was undeniable, but it seemed almost impossible to believe. Could one woman have been responsible for 16 deaths across 4 states over 14 years? Could she have operated with such impunity, moving from household to household, family to family, without ever arousing serious suspicion? The descriptions vary slightly, Captain Brennan observed. Different hair color, different names, different accents, but the age is always about the same, and those scars. He paused, remembering his most recent encounter with a domestic servant bearing such marks. "My God, Thomas, I think she may have been in my office just 3 months ago." The investigation of Elena Fitzgerald's death had brought Captain Brennan into contact with Mary Sullivan, the grief-stricken housekeeper who had discovered the body. He remembered her scarred right hand, her convincing tears, her detailed account of the night's tragic events. If Thomas's theory was correct, Captain Brennan had been face to face with one of the most prolific killers in New England's history without realizing it. The challenge now was proving a connection between Mary Sullivan and the previous crimes, without fingerprinting or other modern identification techniques. Establishing that multiple servants were actually the same woman would require careful detective work, and ideally photographic evidence that could link her to previous investigations. It was Thomas who remembered the photograph. During his review of the Underwood case file, he had noticed a reference to photographic evidence taken at the scene. Most police departments routinely photographed crime scenes by 1904, but few maintained organized archives of such evidence. If the photograph of Elizabeth Hayes from the Underwood investigation still existed, it might provide the proof needed to establish her connection to subsequent crimes. The search for that photograph would lead the Brennan into the dusty archives of Providence's police department, where 16 years of evidence from unsolved cases waited to reveal their secrets. What they would find there would not only confirm Thomas's theory, but provide the key to finally capturing one of the most successful serial killers in American history. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Providence intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The basement archives of the Providence Police Department in 1920 were a maze of filing cabinets, evidence boxes, and forgotten case materials that represented 2 decades of criminal investigations. Detective Captain William Brennan and his son Thomas descended into this bureaucratic netherworld on a cold February morning, armed with a list of case numbers and dates that they hoped would yield the photographic evidence needed to prove their incredible theory. The Underwood case file from 1904 was eventually located in a mild dude box marked Accidental Deaths, Closed Cases. Inside, along with witness statements and investigation notes, was the photograph that Jonathan Underwood had taken that March afternoon 16 years earlier. The image, though somewhat faded, clearly showed the 3 figures in the parlor of the Federal Hill mansion. Jonathan standing beside his wife's chair, Beatrice seated with her hands folded, and Elizabeth Hayes positioned behind them with her scarred right hand resting on the back of Beatrix's chair. Thomas examined the photograph with a magnifying glass, studying every detail of Elizabeth Hayes's face and posture, even accounting for changes that 16 years might bring. He was convinced that this was the same woman who had been working as Mary Sullivan in the Fitzgerald household. The bone structure, the way she held her head, the distinctive positioning of that scarred hand, all were consistent with his memories of the grieving servant who had discovered his aunt's body. But photographic evidence alone would not be sufficient to build a legal case against a woman who had operated under multiple identities across several states. Captain Brennan knew that they would need to trace Elizabeth Hayes's movements systematically, connecting her to as many of the suspicious deaths as possible through documentation that would hold up in court. This meant requesting case files from police departments in Hartford, Boston, Newport, and other cities where similar accidents had occurred. The process of gathering evidence was complicated by the limited communication networks between law enforcement agencies in 1920. Each request for information required formal correspondence, and many smaller departments had poor record-keeping systems that made retrieving old case files difficult or impossible. Captain Brennan used his professional connections and reputation to expedite requests, but the investigation still took months to complete. Meanwhile, Thomas had undertaken the challenging task of tracking Elizabeth Hayes's current whereabouts. If she was indeed responsible for the pattern of deaths they had identified, she would likely have moved on to another position shortly after the Fitzgerald incident. Thomas contacted domestic employment agencies throughout New England, providing descriptions and asking about recent placements of experienced housekeepers who matched Elizabeth's general characteristics. The breakthrough came in May 1920 when an employment agency in Hartford contacted Thomas about a woman named Helen Murphy, who had been placed with a wealthy family in Stamford, Connecticut, just 2 months after Elena Fitzgerald's death. The physical description matched Elizabeth Hayes exactly, including the telltale scars on her right hand that she had explained to her new employers as the result of an old kitchen accident. Captain Brennan immediately contacted the Stamford Police Department, requesting that they place Helen Murphy under surveillance, while Providence prepared formal charges based on the evidence they had accumulated. The request was handled delicately, as alerting Elizabeth to police interest would almost certainly cause her to disappear before she could be arrested. Stamford detectives began monitoring the household where she worked, noting her routines and documenting her interactions with her current employer, Mrs. Dorothy Whitman. What the surveillance revealed was deeply disturbing. Helen Murphy was already implementing the isolation tactics that had preceded her previous crimes. She had convinced Mrs. Whitman that social gatherings were too taxing for someone of her delicate constitution, gradually reducing the woman's contact with friends and family. She had taken over management of household medications and meals, always claiming to be concerned about Mrs. Whitman's health and well-being. Most ominously, she had been observed spending long periods alone in the basement where the house's gas and heating systems were located. The decision to arrest Elizabeth Hayes was made on June 15, 1920, when Stamford detectives reported that she had been seen tampering with gas fixtures in Mrs. Whitman's bedroom during the early morning hours. Captain Brennan traveled to Stamford with a warrant and a team of officers, planning to take Elizabeth into custody before she could claim another victim. The arrest took place on a bright June morning as Elizabeth was leaving the Whitman house to purchase groceries in downtown Stamford. She was walking along a tree-lined street carrying a small market basket when Captain Brennan approached her from behind and identified himself as a police officer. Her reaction was immediate and telling. Rather than confusion or surprise, she displayed the calculating calm of someone who had always known this moment might come. "I suppose you finally figured it out," she said quietly, setting down her basket and extending her hands to be handcuffed. "I wondered how long it would take." Her scarred right hand, the hand that had been described in 16 police reports over as many years, trembled slightly as Captain Brennan secured the restraints. During the train journey back to Providence, Elizabeth Hayes remained largely silent, staring out the window at the New England countryside that had been the stage for her 16-year killing spree. When Captain Brennan asked why she had committed such terrible crimes, she turned to him with those pale blue eyes that had seemed so kind and understanding to her victims. "You wouldn't understand," she said simply. "Those women had everything. Beautiful homes, devoted husbands, security, respect. They had lives that girls like me could never hope for, and they spent their time complaining about how difficult it all was." Her voice carried no remorse, only a cold bitterness that had apparently driven her to destroy what she could never possess. "And the jewelry?" Captain Brennan asked. "Was it just about money?" Elizabeth's smile was thin and humorless. "The jewelry was proof," she said. "Proof that I had taken something from them that they valued. Money was useful, but the real satisfaction was knowing that I had ended their ungrateful lives and taken their precious things as trophies." The trial of Elizabeth Hayes began in Providence Superior Court on October 3, 1920, drawing newspaper coverage throughout New England. The prosecution, led by Rhode Island's Attorney General with assistance from young Thomas Brennan, presented a methodical case that linked Elizabeth to 16 deaths across 4 states through a combination of physical evidence, witness testimony, and documentation of her movements between households. The photograph from the Underwood case served as crucial evidence, establishing Elizabeth's identity and connecting her to the first known murder in the series. Subsequent photographs found in other police files, along with detailed descriptions of her distinctive hand scars, created an unbreakable chain of evidence linking her to multiple crime scenes over nearly 2 decades. Elizabeth's defense attorney argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that household accidents were tragically common in an era of dangerous gas fixtures and primitive safety systems. He suggested that his client had been the victim of an extraordinary series of coincidences, repeatedly finding employment with families destined for tragedy, but the prosecution's case was overwhelming. Thomas Brennan had painstakingly documented Elizabeth's movements between cities and households, showing how she systematically targeted vulnerable women whose husbands traveled frequently on business. The pattern of missing jewelry, the consistent timeline of employment followed by suspicious deaths, and the physical evidence of tampering with household systems created a narrative that no reasonable jury could ignore. The most damaging testimony came from Mrs. Dorothy Whitman, Elizabeth's intended final victim in Stamford. Mrs. Whitman described how Elizabeth had gradually isolated her from friends and family, claiming concern for her health while secretly undermining her confidence and independence. She testified about the strange remedies Elizabeth had prepared, the unusual taste of food and drink after Elizabeth's arrival, and the growing sense of being watched and controlled within her own home. "She made me feel as though I was losing my mind," Mrs. Whitman told the hushed courtroom. "Every suggestion she made seemed reasonable, caring even, but somehow I found myself becoming weaker, more confused, more dependent on her for everything. If the police hadn't intervened when they did, I have no doubt that I would have suffered the same fate as those other poor women." The prosecution also presented testimony from several of Elizabeth's former employers who had survived their encounters with her. These witnesses described similar patterns of manipulation and control, though they had been fortunate enough to terminate Elizabeth's employment before she could complete her deadly work. Their accounts painted a picture of a woman who possessed an almost supernatural ability to identify and exploit the psychological vulnerabilities of lonely, anxious wives. Dr. Edmund Morrison, a psychiatrist from Boston who had been called as an expert witness, testified about Elizabeth's mental state and the psychological profile that emerged from the evidence. He described her as a highly intelligent individual who had developed an elaborate fantasy of revenge against the social class she felt had rejected her. In her mind, he suggested, killing these women was not simply murder for profit, but a form of justice against those who had been given advantages she had been denied. The defendant appears to have constructed an entire world view in which her victims deserved their fate. Dr. Morrison explained to the jury, she genuinely believed that these women were ungrateful for their blessings, that they had failed to appreciate the comfortable lives their marriages had provided. By killing them and taking their jewelry, she was not only enriching herself, but punishing them for what she perceived as their lack of gratitude. Elizabeth herself remained largely silent throughout the trial, showing little emotion as witness after witness testified about her crimes. She listened with apparent disinterest to descriptions of her victims' final moments, occasionally taking notes, but never displaying remorse or distress. Her pale blue eyes, which had once seemed so kind and understanding to the women she targeted, now appeared cold and calculating as they surveyed the courtroom proceedings. The only time Elizabeth showed genuine reaction was when the prosecution displayed the jewelry that had been recovered from her various hiding places. Necklaces, earrings, brooches, and bracelets that had belonged to 16 different women were laid out on a table before the jury, each piece representing a life that had been ended for the sake of greed and twisted revenge. As Elizabeth looked at her collection of trophies, a slight smile crossed her face, not of remorse, but of satisfaction at the tangible proof of her deadly success. The trial lasted 6 weeks, with the prosecution methodically presenting evidence linking Elizabeth to each of the 16 deaths. The defense could offer little beyond challenges to the timing of certain events and suggestions that some of the deaths might genuinely have been accidental. When Elizabeth's attorney asked her if she wanted to testify on her own behalf, she declined with a simple shake of her head, apparently confident that her silence would serve her better than any explanation she might offer. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with their verdict. As the foreman stood to announce their decision, the packed courtroom fell completely silent. Elizabeth Hayes was found guilty on all 16 counts of first-degree murder, making her one of the most prolific serial killers in American legal history. The systematic nature of her crimes, the vulnerable population she had targeted, and the calculated cruelty of her methods left no room for mercy in the jury's consideration. Judge Harrison Blackstone, in pronouncing sentence, spoke directly to Elizabeth about the magnitude of her crimes. "You have violated the most sacred trust that exists between employer and servant." He told her these women welcomed you into their homes, treated you with kindness and respect, and trusted you with their safety and well-being. In return, you systematically destroyed their lives for your own selfish gain. The court can find no mitigating circumstances that would justify clemency in your case. Elizabeth Hayes was sentenced to death by electrocution. the sentence to be carried out at the Rhode Island State Prison. As the judge pronounced the words that would end her life, Elizabeth finally showed emotion, not fear or remorse, but what appeared to be relief that her long deception was finally over. She nodded slightly as if accepting a business proposition, and was led from the courtroom without looking back at the families of her victims who had gathered to witness her judgment. The appeals process that followed was largely peremptory. Elizabeth's attorneys filed the required motions challenging various aspects of the trial, but their hearts seemed not to be in the effort. The evidence against their client was simply too overwhelming, and Elizabeth herself showed little interest in fighting the death sentence. She spent her final months in prison writing what she claimed was a memoir of her crimes, though prison officials later destroyed the manuscript to prevent it from being published and potentially inspiring other criminals. Elizabeth Hayes was executed on March 15, 1922, exactly 18 years after she had first entered the Underwood mansion and begun her killing spree. Prison records indicate that she remained unrepentant until the end, expressing no regret for her victims and no gratitude toward the families who had employed her. Her final words spoken to the prison chaplain were reportedly, "They never deserved what they had anyway." The case of Elizabeth Hayes became a landmark in American criminal investigation, demonstrating the importance of communication between law enforcement agencies and systematic record-keeping. The pattern of her crimes had been visible for years, but only when Detective Captain Brennan and his son Thomas compiled information from multiple jurisdictions did the full scope of her deadly career become apparent. A photograph taken in the Underwood parlor that March day in 1904 found its way into criminal justice textbooks as an example of how seemingly innocent evidence could prove crucial to solving complex cases. Those scarred hands captured forever in silver emulsion had finally told their story to someone who understood their significance. In the aftermath of the trial, several reforms were implemented to prevent similar crimes in the future. Employment agencies began requiring more thorough background checks for domestic servants. Police departments improved their record-keeping and communication systems, and wealthy families became more cautious about hiring household help without proper verification of references and employment history. The 16 families who had lost wives, mothers, and daughters to Elizabeth Hayes's calculated cruelty found what consolation they could in knowing that justice had finally been served. But for many of them, the knowledge that their loved ones had died not in tragic accidents, but as victims of cold-blooded murder made their grief even more difficult to bear. The case also raised uncomfortable questions about the social conditions that had enabled Elizabeth's crimes. The isolation of wealthy wives, their dependence on domestic servants for companionship and support, and the general invisibility of household workers within upper-class society had all contributed to creating the perfect environment for a predator like Elizabeth Hayes to operate undetected for so many years. Perhaps most disturbing was the realization that Elizabeth's success had depended largely on the victim's own kindness and trust. The women she killed had welcomed her into their homes, confided their fears and anxieties to her, and treated her with the respect and consideration that any employee deserved. Their generosity and humanity had been turned against them by someone who saw their kindness not as virtue, but as weakness to be exploited. This mystery shows us that evil sometimes wears the most innocent faces, hiding behind genuine seeming tears and expressions of care. The scarred hands in that forgotten photograph held secrets that took 16 years to reveal, but when the truth finally emerged, it exposed one of the most chilling criminal minds in American history. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Elizabeth Hayes's motives were truly as simple as jealousy and greed? Or was there something even darker driving her to kill 16 innocent women? Leave your comment below and share your theories about what could turn a domestic servant into such a methodical killer. If you enjoyed this dark tale from America's past and want more stories like this, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves historical mysteries. Until next time, remember that the most ordinary photograph can sometimes reveal the most extraordinary secrets.